Hi, I want to talk about crankshaft balancing in a two-stroke single cylinder, and the the what I want to focus on is the method in which people use to find how to balance the crank. I'm not talking about touring the crank. I'm talking about balancing it. And I have a spreadsheet which I developed, which takes all the factors into consideration. The centrifugal force on the crank, the piston inertia, also the compression of the engine, and it is able to give me a graph, a 360-degree graph, which is what this red graph is right here. The farther from zero the graph is, the more that force is. You can imagine the crankshaft rotating 360 degrees, okay? And so the idea is with the right balance, you're going to have less vibration. And this shows right here that when I removed that center hole right there, or filled it back in, I've got too much vertical, up and down vertical force, as opposed to the horizontal force. And the idea is to make those two pretty much equal. And this is another representation of what's happening as you go every 15 degrees of that 360 degree rotation. It shows you the amount of radial force there is. And so it's basically this amount of variation here that you want to limit as much as possible. And you do that by matching the vertical and the horizontal forces against each other. So that's my method, because I never could find a static method that was satisfactory to me. And I think this video is necessary because I don't think anyone has ever presented a good argument against the static method before. So I want to explain why I believe it's not a good method. There's two ways of doing that I've seen. And one, with your crankshaft suspended, like something right here, it's resting on something right here. So on both sides of the crankshaft, you've got the shaft itself, the center shaft, resting on something. And you could oil it to make sure it's nice and slick. And so the idea is to put the conrod pin horizontal to that shaft, and then either hang the piston assembly attached to the conrod, or use the balance factor, which is if you take the conrod here without the piston attached to it, and you move it out here horizontally, and you let the small end rest on a balance, like a postal balance. It'll tell you how many grams it has. That's a small end weight of the conrod. So in this case, it's 41 grams. And the piston assembly, including the wrist pin, is 74 grams. Those two together are 115 grams. If you use a balance factor of 0.6, that gives you 69 grams. So if you hang 69 grams worth of nuts and bolts here from the conrod, then the idea is to drill out the holes or fill in the holes until this will balance. So if you take your hand off the crank, it will stay in this position. If there's not enough holes, it's too heavy, it'll go down, it'll rotate to the right. If the holes are too big, it'll rotate to the left. So the idea is to balance against that. But in this example, this is a balanced engine. Okay, this is an engine I owned years ago, and the engine was pretty smooth. You could look out the rearview mirror. riding down the road at full speed. So I ran through the calculations of what it would take, and with a balance factor of 0.6, this hole would have to be enlarged from 6.5 millimeters to 11.5. With a balance factor of 0.5, it would have to be enlarged to 10.4 millimeters. And then I backtracked to find out what the balance factor would have to be for it to keep that same size, which is the correct size, and it would have to be 0.23. And if you look at the websites or listen to people that use this method, they always use like 0.5 to 0.6, pretty much in that range. And I'm just, I'm trying my best to try to get it to work, and I cannot. And it's not because I'm doing it wrong, it's because it's not a good method. I think the only people that are successful at using the balance factor are the ones that have the balancing machines, and they know how to do it right with that. I'm assuming. I don't have any experience with it. I'm just hope and pray that they're not ripping people off. They're actually balancing their cranks correctly. But like I always said, if you want something done right, do it yourself. And that's why I created this spreadsheet. And there's a lot of calculations in this spreadsheet. If you scroll down, you look at all this that's going on here. All those calculations are used to come up with this graph right here. And visually you can tell whether or not it's getting close, but the idea is to look at this number right here, and you want to get as close to 1 as possible. So I'm just going to take a look on the web right now, and I want to show you some pages I found. This one right here backs up what I'm saying about that technique being created for 90-degree V8 engines. It's for car engines, and it talks about some reasons it's not an all-inclusive method. For one, it doesn't include the pressure, the cranking pressure of the engine, which detracts from the upward piston inertia on the compression stroke. And no matter when you change the RPM, like it's right now, this one's set at 9150, and it's balanced for that RPM. But if you go down in RPM, the balance is going to change because the compression PSI does not change. Look at how crazy it went going down to 3,000. So let's go. A typical power band of a motorcycle is about 2,000 RPM. So I'm going to see what it looks like at 7,000. That's pretty good. And the ratio here of vertical to horizontal is 0.98. So that's cool. What does it look like at 5,000? It jumped down to 0.82. Okay. So let me see, there's another website I want to show. This YouTube video, well anyway, he puts a piston on there, and then he adjusts the holes so that it balances while it's hanging there with the piston. That's his method, and giving that a shot, it also failed the test, and it wound up needing about, what was that, about 10.7 millimeter hole right here instead of the 6.5. So it's also too far off. So I don't advocate that method either. this is talking about some stuff. What is it I wanted to know about this? Like so many aspects of race engine design, the choice of balance factor is a matter of compromise. Oh yeah, this is the one where he's saying there's a large range of balance factors. 20 to 80%. I mean, to me, just automatically that just screams not a good method. Because if you have a good method, it's universal. And if you're going to say, well, you know, if you're in the business of balancing cranks and you know for 250 motocrossers what balance factor you can use, well, you can get away with it. But you know, you just bought a bike, you've never done this before, forget balance factor. You have no earthly idea where in that percentage range you should be. And you're not going to find anyone to tell you either. So, you know, why not just spend a few bucks, get the program that you can use successfully to balance the crank. This is another site, and I think they're talking about the machine method where they use 100% of rotating weight and 50% of reciprocating weight. I need to point this out also. When people try to make the to balance the crank using some kind of weight method, you know, or measuring the piston weight and the con rod and all that, it's almost like the assumption is this force of the piston moving up and down is to be considered like a centrifugal force, but it's not. It's an inertia force. It's jerking up and down, changing direction, accelerating, decelerating, and it's a completely different force. And the graph of that force in regard to RPM is different than the graph of the force of centrifugal. Let me show you. This is the graph of the upward force, and this is the graph of the downward force. The downward force is the centrifugal force from the crank. The upward force, this is specifically at TDC, is from the inertia of the piston. And you see they don't have the same curvature. So to me, every one of those methods that are using weights, and even, you know, even a machine where they're spinning the crank, I'm not saying it's impossible to get it right, but it's not a universal method. It's a trial and error method, and they do that and they find what works, and then they keep doing that. In other words, they don't even need the method because the method sucks. When you say, you know, all 250 motocrossers need a balance factor of 0.65 or whatever, 0.45, whatever. It's just saying this is what I tested, and I found it to be fairly good, and this is what I recommend. And so any method of their method of trying to find out what works is not a method. It isn't. It's just a system of repeating what they have found to work in the past. And it's ridiculous. So when you use a spreadsheet, now that's a method. You're putting in all the weights, all the dimensions, the computer's calculating the centrifugal force and the inertia force, adding them together and plotting on a 360-degree graph what the result is. Now that's a method, and it's universal. It'll work on any crankshaft, any RPM, and it's to me it's the only way. I'm sorry, it's just the only way. You know, it's like if someone makes the old method work, well, good for them. But to me, it's what I call a Fred Flintstone method, and I make no apologies for being brash about it because I think this is year 2018, and it's time to start taking advantage of computer power, and that's where it's at. Okay. And this is my website where I talk about my Excel spreadsheet and what's going on with balancing. And there's a nice little graph down here. This is the graph I got using that 0.6 balance factor. So at 0 and 180 degrees, you've got at TDC and BDC, you've got little radial force exerting on the crankshaft. But then at 90 degrees either direction, you've got a large radial force. So that means it corrected vertically, and with that vertical correction, it caused a horizontal imbalance. And with my Excel spreadsheet, you're able to balance both the vertical and the horizontal, so you have as much minimal variation in those radial forces as possible for minimal vibration. And this is an example of someone with a motorized bicycle engine. It came stock with this graph right here, and after using my spreadsheet, he got it right here, and he told me what he thought of it right here. That's Jim Baker. Okay, so I think that's about all I want to say on the subject. If you want to do something right, do it yourself. Thanks for watching.